We live now on a road up to our place. New Zealand Carbon Farming have planted 1,350 hectares of trees, which boundary one of our boundaries, and the Beltons on the other side have also put forestry in. I think the largest larch forest in New Zealand, and about 7 different species of gum, so that's far more attractive than the carbon farming on our left going up, which is pines, but we've actually got about 80 hectares of our own. Separate to that was there before any of that started, but my experience is only really from 1,600 feet and above, and it really started in 1975. You might remember there was a very large wind, and we had a plantation of Oregons that was blown down, and that plantation was planted in 1920, and in 75 it was wiped out, and within 20 years we had about 8 hectares of Oregons that had taken over a block adjacent, all self-sown, and we realised that Oregons were the best growing trees on our property, but they, after about 30 years, on a 12-month period, they'll spread faster than gorse. And we now control those self-sown Oregons with helicopters, and it took us about 30 years to work out it was actually more dangerous than gorse. So, although they're the best growing trees on our property, we won't grow them there for that reason. And what we learned out of that, the government in the 70s were paying a 50% subsidy for trees, so I planted about 8 hectares or 9 hectares of Pinus muricata at about 2,200 feet. They, as it turned out, they were meant to be the high country trees. They're actually worthless. We got one payment, pre-1990 payment, carbon payment, and that's all we'll ever get from them. They only have firewood value. So in 1994, I'd read about the possibility of carbon farming and decided we'd try and diversify our income if possible, and so I planted about 50 hectares of radiata in 1994. And when the scheme came in 1990, we sold, saved up credits, and we sold them for $20, which was quite good at the time, money for jam, because we didn't really think it would last. And then of course the market crashed, and as Mark mentioned, I think it got to about $1.80, and we had, because we'd sold it quite a few credits at $20, we had a liability. So I think we bought Ukrainian credits at 27 cents and repaid our liability, and then the government closed the loop, so those days are gone too. But there's one thing I learned when I was a young child: if you're sitting on Father Chris's knee, you don't jump off in a hurry if he's around. So I put the other lesson out of that: when the government's handing out money, don't do it just for the sake of getting the money. Make sure it's going to work. Interesting enough, how stupid that scheme was. To get the 27 cent Ukrainian credits, you had to leave the scheme. I left the scheme, repaid the liability, and 2 days later rejoined the scheme. And that was all perfectly legal. At the moment, we've been saving up credits, and we did consider selling them at 25, but I've been strongly advised not to do that, because if the cap is lifted, there is a suggestion they could go straight to $50. But no one knows that, but that's the commercial advice I've been given. So at this stage, we're not selling. We're going to wait for a year and see what happens, and make the call. The other call we've got to make is: do we want to sell the carbon credits, or do we actually just hold on to them and for the future, money in the bank? Or if we continue selling them every year, we never cut the trees down. And you can do that. You just make the decision they're never going to cut them down. You just take the money every year. But what we did in '94, rightly or wrongly, we top dressed the plantation with boron, and we also pruned the trees. Spent a considerable amount of money pruning. And the theory behind that is, if the timber becomes quite valuable and they're pruned and the job's done right, you can have carbon farming and you can get the money from the timber if you choose the right time to harvest that timber, or if you choose to start planting, say 5 years before, you cut down part of the forest and you just keep planting so you don't get caught. So we've got to make that decision. We'll make that next year probably, seeing what happens. What I'd do differently next time, especially now that we've got a large amount of several kilometres of boundary with trees, new fencing, we spent money on new fencing. I'd do it all in deer fencing in the future. It's only about $2 a metre difference. And I'd incorporate deer traps. We've got problems, we're now intensifying, we've got crops by the trees and we've got a lot of deer, and we've shot something like 150 deer with a helicopter in the last 12 months, and it's economical to do that at the moment, but that might not be in the future. And I think probably if you've got large-scale forestry, there's a real opportunity for putting in deer traps and farming venison, or capturing them. And I was at a property in Southland about 2 months ago that are doing that, and they're incorporating larger tussock blocks with deer fencing, and they captured last year $500,000 worth of deer by putting the deer fencing in and then chasing them through, keeping them for 2 months and then selling them at $12 a kilo. So I think there's that's not to be sniffed at, because there's a lot, the deer population through the South Island, as a lot of you know, are increasing, and so that's something that could be looked at. Yeah, I think in the future, what we would look at too is some of the creeks and valleys. If you're putting a water scheme intensifying, you could put in trees, and again incorporate those traps and use the government money, even in some cases of natives, depending on your property. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got to offer. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, well, I've got a couple of questions for you to start with, just to kind of expand a little bit more on what you've been doing. How well does the forestry that you've got on your farm fit into the rest of the farming operation?
Well, in our case, I did it on a couple of exposed tops, and we've since developed putting in brassica crops, and it's been a great help. It protects us from the south, and we can get better crops. So we've incorporated it as part of our grazing operation. So that's been quite helpful.
Cool. So following on from that, then, how easy is it to manage the forestry and manage the program that it's in? You've got to. I think you have the roads in the right place and the fences when you start. And I didn't mention, we also insure our trees for carbon loss. So if they do get burnt down, we are insured for carbon credits. We pay, I don't know what we pay, $1,500 a year to do that, but I think it's a worthwhile investment because the trees are getting larger. But we've done our pruning, and the boron went on early, and other than that, really there's not a lot involved. Cool. So why did you decide to do it?
In the mid-90s, I had a couple of friends that had trees and made a lot of money. In fact, I had a friend at the top of Lake Ohau that cut down 9 hectares of Oregons that were planted in 1927, and he got $1.5 million for the trees, and I thought that's a good idea. If we plant it, maybe it would happen to me one day. But also diversify the income, having only 2 or 3 sources of income. I think it's another. I didn't do it to save the planet. I did it to diversify our operation. But I was intrigued by the idea of carbon farming at that time. I could see in the future it was going to happen, so I just thought it's a chance to give it a go.
Excellent. Any other questions from the crowd? We've got time for a few more.
What class of land was the land that you planted out in trees? Was it the contours of wheel tractor country? Was it grazing land? Was it what did the trees displace when you planted?
Yeah, well, the block we've actually developed only recently in the last few years. We've actually ploughed up a lot of that country. So some of it could be ploughed, some of it was a bit steeper, the gullies, but it was on the south side exposed. So the crops we've done are on the north side of the trees. So in fact, with the pruning, we didn't prune the sort of the first 6 or 7 outside rows because the wind can get so strong. I thought if I pruned it, it could open up the plantation. But to answer your question, some of it could be in brassica, but it would be more exposed than what it is now with the trees there.
What altitude is that, though?
About 1,700 feet.